thank you. I'm really happy that you're here. And we will have a really interesting discussion on some current projects on decolonial movements and history taking place in Europe. And yes, so my name is Tania Lancheno, and Sonia asked me to introduce myself a little bit before introducing the panelists. I work in this city about the colonial history of this city, and I recently also published a collection of essays dealing with the decolonial memories around Hamburg. So feel free, if you have access to the German language, to check it out. It's also not as expensive as normally academic books are, and also written in a way that you can all learn from hidden histories around our city. So that's me, and now I'm really happy to introduce our amazing guest tonight, and I will start with Laura Gansa, who is joining us from the screen. And she's a social cultural worker convinced of the transformative power of art. Her work in non-profit organizations focuses on decolonization issues in the development aid sector. She emphasizes the role that diasporas may take in redefining new modes of cooperation, and she joined us from Belgium. João holds a PhD in history, focusing on Portuguese colonialism in Angola. He has taught and consulted at various public institutions, and he has worked also as a translator. Furthermore, he has collaborated with NGOs on anti-racism initiatives, and he is currently a research associate at the Kate Hamburger College Legal Unity and Pluralism in Münster, and is working on a monograph, I suppose, about colonialism. We will hear about this in a second, a little bit more, founded by the Portuguese Science and Technology Foundation. And now I can introduce to you Mikael Asit-Kinga. He has also a PhD in history and is an art historian. His PhD is entitled Cameroonian Objects of Power in German Museums, Meaning and Significance from the Violent Colonial Exploitation to Post-Colonial History. This project was completed, his PhD was completed within the framework of the larger project, Reverse History of Collections, Cameroon's Material Heritage in German Museums. He and his colleagues in this project have conducted a comprehensive inventory of Cameroonian cultural heritage in German public museums, which resulted last year in the publication of a really interesting book called Atlas of Absence, Cameroon's Cultural Heritage in Germany. And his research interests also include the provenance of Cameroonian human remains from colonial contexts. So thank you very much for being with us today. Okay, so we will also have enough time for your questions, so please feel free to write them down so you don't forget. I will check the time, and we will have enough time to discuss afterwards. Normally in these kinds of events, we always begin with a general question, and I asked already in advance our panelists of tonight to explain their views on Europe. So what is Europe for you? Where does it end? Where does it begin, and where does it end? Would you like to start, Laura, if it's okay for
you? Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. Thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to do this from Belgium. And sitting in Belgium, it is Europe. I think we feel Europe a lot. Living in Belgium, it is something that we are maybe more aware than a lot of other countries, being always in contact with the European Commission, the European Parliament, especially working in the non-profit sector in Brussels. We have a very strong European identity. at the end of the day being so close. And I think it's really hard for me to say what Europe really is and where it ends, as I am often reminded that I am not part of this Europe, and that this Europe can take many forms and can extend, but its empathy and its laws do not seem to extend to people who look like me. But if I have to answer the question of what is Europe and where does it end, it is growing. I think it has expanded all the way to Africa nowadays. I think we can see how its influence is very clear on the borders and the way the borders are managed in the north of Africa, and which impact it has had on the sub-Saharan region. We can see it in the laws that are being passed in Georgia nowadays, pushed by Russia, but we have a big fear of this Europe who is growing every day. I think it is growing, and I think at the same time, as the elections are coming close, it is trying very hard to get smaller and to become less inviting, to become less of this dream of openness, of peace that it has been for a long time. I think I studied political sciences with this very strong belief in the European Union, and I think year after year we are reminded that it is more a dream than a reality, and that its borders will always be reminded to us when we try to discuss of this peaceful dream, of this dream of union, of this dream also of being an example for the rest of the world. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Of course you did, of course you did. Thank you. Yeah, you gave us a lot of material to write. And so thank you very much. Michael, would you like to?
Yeah, of course. Is the mic on? Okay. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for the invitation to Osara FAO. And it's a privilege also for me to be here. And thank you to Laura for those introductory words. And I am based in Berlin, and we are celebrating Europe during this European Week. And I heard a lot about migration, about environment, about social things. And I would say that Europe is not that just migration. Europe is not just the Second World War or the First World War, or Europe is not just Germany, or Europe is not just France. I'm more interested in the colonial past of Europe, because even in the different schools in European countries, it is a topic that is just absent, because people grew up, they go to school, and at the end of the day, they never know that Germany had colonies. And I had still classmates at university doing their PhD. They have never heard in their life that Germany had colonies. And that is something that Germany has prepared very well. And that's how Germany trains its citizens to be at the end. It's not something that comes from a vacuum, that university students do not know about the German past. And it's not just a German reality that you go to France, it's the same thing, you go to Belgium, it's the same thing, and many other European countries share this reality. So for me, it's interesting that in that European week, we speak also about the colonial history, because it is a shared history with the world. Celebrating Europe as if it was not linked to the other parts of the world is something that is not efficient from my viewpoint, because Europe is sometimes Cameroonian history, Togolese history, Namibian history, South African history, and asking about the Europe of today, or the meaning is also to say what was Europe yesterday, what is Europe today, and what will be Europe tomorrow. So those are different time frames. We can't really delineate from one another, because the world Europe is mixed up with that colonial past, and colonial past means also that there were things that were not that so really nice to be encountered, to be narrated, and also to be shown. That's why we are talking about Europe today. And the idea of Europe is also something that is presented as if European countries were very homogeneous, but it's not the case. And speaking about Europe brings me also to deconstruct the idea that Africa is a country. Because some of the time they speak about Africa as a country, but Africa is not a country. And even a single country like Congo, we have more than 40 different ethnic groups with 40 hundreds languages. It means in a single country, you have a lot of different cultures, realities, vision of the world, and all that. That's just a one country. And when you try to really go through or travel through Africa, you'll be tired of learning things that are really new to you, because Africa is a big country, and at the same time I say Africa is not a country, neither is Europe. That's why sometimes I'm a bit disturbed to hear about European as a unity. Is it? But it's not always a unity. And I think that we have also to pay attention to those differences that are part of Europe, and we have also to pay attention to those similarities that Europe presents, but more on a very political level. If it is the case, that is also something that is questionable. So for me, I think I'm more interested in those historical aspects, and not just environment. That is also important, and not just migration, and not just the election that are in some weeks to be done in Europe.
In 1 week, actually, yes.
Yeah, in 1 week.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I will begin as well thanking you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Sonia. And thank you, Tanya, for the introduction. And Mikhail and Paula for already bringing so many topics to the discussion. I think that perhaps being a historian, I'm more interested in when Europe is or begins and when it will end, to see if I can be speculative about it, than actually the geography, its place of it. And I think this matters a lot, because if you look at the Portuguese Empire or the Spanish Empire, and together, they were together for some time, until the 19th century, there was no idea of being part of Europe or being European. The model of a Catholic monarchy, of a universal monarchy, was what held the empire together. And note that for some years, the capital of the empire was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, not in Lisbon. So this is interesting, because when this idea of Portugal being part of Europe or being a European empire comes, is when you have what is called the Third Empire, the African Empire. So especially after the Berlin Conference of 84 and 85, 1884 and 1885, is when Portugal starts trying to become a player in this concept of European players and European nations. So Portugal opens up to Europe at the same time that it races in the scramble for Africa. So it is very impossible to separate this last stage of the empire, the scramble for Africa, one of the most violent stages of the empire, from this attempt of Portugal to become part of this new macro entity called Europe. Because until then, of course, you have the Asian Empire or Brazil, but I don't think there was ever an idea of being part of Europe. So from the perspective of Lisbon, Europe comes always together with colonialism, imperialism in Africa specifically. And this is interesting because it shows how much these things are together. And it also opens the door to think of when this idea of Portugal being in Europe, because it's also colonizing a nation, when does it end, right? So when does this idea of Europe end? And I think that I agree with Mikhail. I think that different places in Europe will have different chronologies of what is Europe. They would look at the Roman Empire, they would look at any other configuration, and we need to have this in mind when we discuss ways of cooperating and criticizing that what is Europe for a Portuguese is tied to something that is very different from to Spanish too, and these things are all over history. And I think that it changes over time as well, because in the 19th century it was tied with this idea of the scramble, and the Portuguese wanted to affirm themselves as Europeans by being as brutal, as Europeans. Not that they have been soft before, but by using machine guns as well, industrial technology, that kind of thing. You also have some transformations, and in the 20th century is this projection of whiteness or an idea of Europe into the past. So then you have archaeologists going to Portugal and discovering that there were Europeans there for 20,000 years. You have Salazar, the dictator, going to the country and rebuilding the Moorish castles, the castles that had been built by the Moors during the 5 centuries of Muslim occupation of Portugal, destroying them and building European-style castles, completely fake in the 50s, so that we become a European country. So this idea of Europe then comes with the erasure of Moorish, Muslim, African, Maghrebin occupation of the same territory. You have all these layers, so I think that historicity is interesting. And then, of course, my other partner is already referred the question of borders and the questions of migration, so I think those are also pressing matters. But
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I mean, I just was thinking the whole time when you were speaking, because I thought also that Columbus gave Europe a face, but you would say it goes a little farther in history, not that early. Talking from a country which is, when we are in Germany or in France, we would have this tendency to see Spain or Portugal as the periphery of Europe. Many people in Spain say, for example, when they migrate to here to Germany, I am going to Europe. I think that's really interesting. Me coming from also a Latin American country, I always thought that Spain was a kind of center, but it's really interesting to see where do people put the center of Europe according from where we are in the world. So how would you address this like dynamics or ambivalences of being a periphery of Europe and at the same time being one of the first countries to have occupied the world?
well, I think that there's a dangerous side to it, and because there's always a temptation to victimize, and that gives you a free, get out of jail free card in a lot of occasions. And I think that you see this in a number of debates. So probably throughout the night I will refer back to this tendency of the Portuguese to victimize. When you discuss restitution, you immediately victim. Oh, in Europe they are more ahead, they have more resources. So in a way, it is a very convenient way of getting rid of these debates. On the other hand, it also creates this compensatory fantasies, right? Because you create an inferiority complex of being there in the middle, and this goes back to what I was mentioning when I talked about the Berlin Conference. It was actually called by the Portuguese because of the border conflict with the British, and in the end, the Portuguese. Even now, even in our national anthem that we have to this day, it's still about this event. We feel as a not me, but we have a national anthem victimizing about the outcome of the Berlin Conference. So 5 years later, in 1890, the British will ultimatum to the Portuguese. They forced an understanding of the borders, and the Portuguese feel like they were victims. And this is our national anthem to today. It's still reference. So being there in the middle, at the same time being a center and feeling like you're an underdog, can lead to all these kind of compensatory behaviors and to a lot of violence and a lot of excuses, right? To victimization. So.
Okay, thank you, Joao, for the clarification. We will now step into the second concept and the title of this presentation. Laura, if you would like to give us your insights. I mean, Joao just make a bridge to the so-called African or Congo Berlin Conference, in which the African continent was divided in Berlin, and in recent years also the city of Berlin, Mikael, perhaps you can also afterwards tell us a little bit, has decided to commemorate the place where this conference took place and make it a little bit more visible in the public space. Those kind of discussions have been taken in Belgium as well, as far as I know. Laura, would you like to tell us your definition of decolonisation, perhaps?
Yeah, I just wanted to say when João was explaining this position of Portugal, I find it very interesting because I do think that Belgium has the same tendency of trying to let everyone forget about Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and remind that Belgium is mainly a small, tiny country surrounded by those very big empires. Belgium is just waffles and fries, and really trying to share this image and always acts very surprised when it is reminded of its own history. A colonial history that started maybe later than a lot of its neighboring countries, but that was violent enough for it to be an important part of Belgian history as well as African history. But yes, to answer your questions, there have been a lot of debates regarding how Belgium deals with its own colonial history. I think a lot of it has been centered around the question of the African Museum, as it is called, in nearby Brussels, which is a museum that was created as a form of propaganda for the colonial enterprise in Belgium, that was funded to be a type of a place where the simple Belgian citizen who would never get a chance to go to Congo could get to see why Belgium was investing so much money and so many people were being spent there. Yeah, of course, it also had a human use, but those Belgian citizens could see what those small native Congolese people who were in need of Belgian help looked like. And this is a history that has been very hard for Belgium to discuss. Because there is this idea that, first of all, the museum has changed. The museum is no longer a museum promoting colonial history, but it is also a museum that has really struggled to talk about its own history. We work a lot with the organizations that I'm part of. We do work a lot with this museum, and they have tried since 2013, since they started renovations, to involve more people in the process of rethinking this museum. But at the same time, it has been completely unable to address the question directly. Being a federal museum, being funded by the federal government, they rely on the official position of Belgium to be able to explicit more clearly what the history of the museum is and why it existed and why there is this need to change, which makes it a very confusing museum, which makes it a museum that no one understands, that you visit alone and you have no idea why it's being presented to you, because it tries to show you part of the history. It will show you what it looked like at the time. It will maybe tell you how it started, but then it will switch to talk about minerals in Congo, and you don't understand directly where the link is, because they will not tell you the link unless, which is something that I think is very Belgian, this little compromise was done where some guides had followed a decolonization training done by an activist group here in Brussels called BANCO, and another one called colonial, who had come and trained some of the guys of the museum to show the more decolonial version of this museum. But you have to explicitly ask for it. This is not the standard visits that you get. So it has allowed the museum, in the image of Belgian society in general, to sit comfortably in the middle. To sit comfortably in this middle where we can say, well, the past was quite bad. It was really bad, but let's not talk about how it has allowed Belgium to become a rich and influential country, and how we still benefit to these days from the knowledge that we've gathered from a century of exploiting the minerals in Congo, making Belgium a place where you have a lot of experts who know about the geology of Congo and the geology of the neighboring countries, and who allows this museum to still get funded today for this type of research. So So I think the museum is such a beautiful example of how Belgium is dealing with it by not dealing with it, by giving funds to the activists and saying, okay, we will take out the statues that are offensive in the museum and we will put them in the archive, just next to all the looted art that we will keep in the archive, and we will do both. And this should satisfy everyone. And I find it fascinating because it is doomed to explode at some point. Because no one is happy. The ones who did not want to change are unhappy because it's already too much change. And the ones who are willing to push for a full decolonial discussion around the museum, but also public space and the general history of Belgium are also unhappy because we have not reached that point either. So yeah, personally, I'm kind of waiting to see when it explodes because it is an unattainable position for the museum, but for Belgian society as a whole.
Okay, thank you. May I just add a little question to clarification? So the activists of Mémoire coloniale are part of the museum, or are kind of precarious researchers dealing from another perspective?
No, so Mémoire coloniale, the full name is Collectif pour la mémoire coloniale et la lutte contre la discrimination. It's a very long name. Is an activist group that deals mainly with the colonial history of Belgium and how it has led to structural racism in Belgium. And they have a few partnerships with the museum that has allowed them, in one side, to do research in the archives of the museum itself, and on the other side, to train some of the guides in the museum. So yeah, it is a partnership. It is a difficult one, but the museum has created a space in its functioning for diaspora groups willing to work with the museum on a viable change and a long-term change.
Okay, thank you, Laura.
No problem.
Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. And I would like also to, before sharing my screen with us and with Laura, the problem of the Belgian colonization is something that is linked to Germany because as Tanzania was a German colony, it included Burundi and Rwanda, and afterwards Belgium come and then those countries split it into 3 different countries, and even today while working on the Cameroon material heritage in Germany, you find a lot of Burundian and Rwandese cultural artifacts in the database of the German museum. So it is a very, very complex question because at the end of the day, nobody knows whether Burundi, for instance, has to address the restitution, the demands for restitution to Germany or to Belgium. And it is something that I've been discussing with the ambassador of Burundi, for instance, for a long time. Until today, we don't have any idea, any solution. So maybe in the audience, there are still people who can come up with some ideas. It will be very interesting. So, like Tanya mentioned before, my team and I have done an inventory of the Cameroonian material heritage in Germany because we are talking a lot about the colonial things, the colonized mind of Europe. We are talking about restitution or return whatsoever. But the main idea in the project is that what is there? How many objects are there? And when we talk about restitutions, it means at least that we must know about what should be restituted because it is not a figurative debate, it is a debate that applies to concrete artifacts that have been translocated. And if we do not know about the concrete amount and the conditions under which they have been transferred to Europe, it is a problem. That's why we have carried out this research. And carrying out this research means also considering the different European countries because Cameroon was colonized by Germany as from 1884 to 1919. And afterwards, France took on from 1919 to 1960 together with Great Britain. That's why Cameroon was divided into two parts, one part for the English people, one part for France. That's why we became, by considering also the Cameroonian collections in France, and we came out with this amount of Cameroonian cultural heritage in France, because when you talk about France, you have to notice that the system is so centralized in Paris that the biggest collections are in Paris. So the only Musée de Quai Branly in Paris holds 9,000 cultural artifacts from Cameroon. There are other collections in Lyon, in Marseille, in other countries, but they are really smaller than that because of the centralization of the French system. And then we went to the British Museum, where we contacted the director of the British Museum, and then he sent us the database of the British Museum, and we found out that the British Museum holds thousands of objects from Cameroon, but then it is the biggest Cameroon collection in England, because in Oxford, in the Pitt Rivers Museum, you have also collection from Cameroon, but it is smaller than that. And then after doing this European tour, we came to our mentor peak, that's Germany, and that is what we found in the German collections. 40,000 objects. To be really precise, it is 60,000, but 20,000 have been destroyed during the First World War and the Second one. That's why this is just to mention the objects that are present. And we work with 45 museums across Germany. So the particularity of Germany is that the system is a federal system. That's why you can find 80,000 objects in Stuttgart, 5,000 in Leipzig, 5,000 in Berlin, 5,000 everywhere. So it's something that is really everywhere in Germany. It's not just in one collection or in one museum. So when you look at this, there are explanations for it, because first of all, Germany was the first European country to colonize Cameroon. So they came and found authentic, really pieces of work or whatsoever, objects or entities, because even the semantics we use to refer to those objects is also really problematic and has been a construction through the European discourse for more than a century. And if we click again, yeah, we see on those maps, and the European one is something that is going from Oxford to Lyon to Vienna to Munich. And one thing is interesting is that most of the European collection, even in St. Petersburg and Moscow, there are Cameroonian objects, but they cross Germany before reaching those different countries. So Hamburg, the city where we are today, was like the main entrance of all those objects, not only to Germany but to Europe. They send human remains, artifacts, animal species, plant species, voice recordings, photographs directly to Hamburg. And then Hamburg receiving all transfer something else. So the main part to Berlin, because it was the political city of the German Empire, and from there the museum staff of Berlin were sent to the other European museum and also to the German museum. So it was something that was done systematically, but very linked to Hamburg and very linked to Berlin. And the Cameroonian objects in Russia, for instance, were also taken for a second time forcefully, because the Red Army of those Soviet European countries have conquered Germany, and one of the things they have done, there is not yet really a research about that, is that they have taken, as they call it, so many African artifacts from German museums, and they have brought them to St. Petersburg and Moscow principally, because they thought that was something, it was presented as trophy, but the Germans say that's a trophy that we do not truly consider, because those objects belong to other people. They are not German objects. There was a debate about that, and then it's very interesting debate, and I think if we follow up that question, we can come up with very interesting results. Germany wanted to show that we have the biggest ethnographic museum, and we can represent all the regions of the world in our country. And once when the objects are taken to another country, they just renounce those objects and say they do not belong to us. We can do whatsoever you want with them, they are not German objects. So that was the German position. And then Russia tried afterward to send some objects to Leipzig again, saying, considering that you are really near to the Communist Party, we give you back as a sign of our goodwill and good relationship some part of those objects, and some Cameroonian objects went back to Leipzig again, but there is a huge amount that is still in Russia, and no one knows how to get in contact with those objects, for instance. So the European we are talking about is not just the European, the Union, the European Union as a political unity, but it's also Russia included. So this complexity exists, but I have also to say that Europe has something, a normative dimension, because at the time, UK, France, and Germany wanted to really conquer the world and present themselves as European colonial powers. And today still there is that normative dimension in the debate about restitution. Due to the Brexit, England is doing its own policy of restitution, where France and Germany are trying to put into place a common policy to really establish laws of restitution, if we want to call them so. But it's something also that is very competitive, because in France, the parliament has the water law, and the president says you restitute, you don't give back, and it is it. In Germany, museums themselves have they are autonomous entities. They have the power to decide to give them back, and then they will inform the land, and then the federal government will be involved. So it is a very complex system, but here in Germany, it functions like on different levels. Whereas in France, it is a national issue. If the government says no, this no applies to all public museums in France. But if the German government says no, Hamburg could decide, we say yes. Berlin could decide, we say yes. So that's why I think for that debate of restitution, it could be European and normative in the sense that they are trying to do something together. But when we consider the particularities of each country, it is very difficult to have a common policy.
Yeah.
That's why we are trying, we are struggling, and they have created this fund now that is hosted at the Mark Bloch Centrum in Berlin to finance research projects where you must have in French, German institution plus an institution in Africa, but it's still something that is very complex, because it is not just a matter of money that you put in research, it's a matter of something else, and that's why I think we still have a long way to go, and difficulties to deal with, because that is a very complex question.
Mikael, can I ask you a short question concerning Vatican? So you were not able to see those collections?
We are able, but the problem is that we have sent a WhatsApp image to the director of the Museum of Vatican, but the Vatican itself is not able to say exactly what they have. They have a very huge museum, but the documentation is kept in Latin. There is maybe 2-3 persons in Vatican who are able to read all the documentations and give you the information you ask. That's why they are willing to work on their own collection, but it's almost impossible because you have to hire people who can translate all those scriptures, manuscript, into French, into German, and something that is accessible to the other Europeans, because today I don't know that, I'm not sure that the half of German citizens speak this language that is in Vatican, and she was really doubting, and she told us that we keep that question mark because even we here in Vatican, we are not sure, and we can't give you a precise amount of the material.
But these are also kind of colonial strategies, right? I mean, once put language as a barrier, and also the legal different ways of not dealing with the problem, right? And saying, yes, we will see, and providence, and so on. What would you say, Joel, regarding these complications and post-colonial uses of right to do unright?
I think that I can only complicate it even more if I bring forward the Portuguese example. I think that the most interesting aspect of Portugal is the absence of a universal museum. We never had one. So, for instance, 1 month ago, about 1 month ago, when the president on the 25th of April brings again the discussion of restitution, reparations from the traffic of enslaved persons, the reaction of some people in the right is immediately, no, we should do a museum of the discovery, so that finally we have a universal museum like the British Museum. So, since the museum never existed, it just haunts Portugal like a ghost that was never achieved, bringing back this ideas of inferiority that need to be compensated. Now, the question of why it never exists, I think it's the fascinating, right? And it has different reasons. So, and it's tied up with Germany and Belgium. So perhaps I will just briefly mention those. I mean, one of the interesting cases when you have the commissions, the mixed commissions between the Congo Free States and Portugal to delimit the borders of Cabinda, the Cabinda enclave and North Angola, is that if you go to the Tavern Museum, to the African Museum in Tavern, you find the diaries of the mixed commissions, and you can read it, that they were coming about, because one thing is for you to draw a border in a map, of course, another thing is for you to go on the territory and build towers marking the border. And they would go and they would say, look, we cannot enter this village because the Minkizi, this statue that we call an idol, exerts this power, so we need to remove it. To have sovereignty, to have European law, we need to remove it. And they remove it. And then the Portuguese are asked, do you want to share the spoil? No, we don't have any interest. And a lot of these objects, the Portuguese were consciously removing in a very violent manner to establish sovereignty in Cabinda. They end up selling them to German consuls. So they end up here in Germany. And or going, of course, to Belgium. And this was not because the Portuguese were not doing this violence, and even in a more conscious manner, because the Portuguese have somehow a longer presence in these areas, and they were aware of what they were doing. They knew they were sending people connected with the law, judges or lawyers. They knew that to establish sovereignty, to have jurisdiction, they needed to get rid, they would say, not only of chieftains, but of these statues that act like chieftains, that have power. And they will do it. And now they are in the Humboldt form, Mangaka, for instance, right? But the Portuguese don't have the museum, right? This is the first moment, so in the late 19th century, first decades of the 20th century. And then you have a second moment, especially in Angola, in which you have this diamond mining company called Diamond. And this is another connection with Belgium, because it's Belgian capital. It's from Miniere and other big companies. And this mining company has two huge swaths of land, is a majestatic company, so they have jurisdiction over a huge territory in north of Angola, northeast of Angola, and they establish a museum there, an ethnographic and artistic museum. And this is when things get strange. So, for you to understand, that there's this classic article about Portuguese ultra-colonialism. This is how Perry Anderson called it, from 1962. It's an article from 1962 at the New Left Review. And he says, look, the strange thing about Portuguese colonialism or ultra-colonialism is that it presents itself as anti-colonial. And this sounds odd. But what happened is that after 61, the strategy of the new state regime was to present its empire as an anti-colonial empire, right? So from 52, they start a campaign, 1952, a campaign of restitution. And they would do this book and this leaflet saying the other empires, they have museums in Europe. And this is the sentence of it. The ethnographers, to have at hand what they need to study, they bring thousands of objects, thousands. And this is barbarism. While the Portuguese, no, we bring them back to Africa. So from 52 to 75, this diamond mining company, together with the regime, would buy pieces in London and Antwerp and send them back to Angola. And this is why you end up having Benin bronzes in Angola, restituted. I mean, it's nonsense, but it's propaganda. And this is the propaganda of the Portuguese regime. Right? So this sounds odd, but for years they were just saying this. Contrary to these big empires, Portugal is doing the opposite, is doing the opposite. And this is why the regime never invested until quite late, until 63, of having an ethnographic museum. And now if you ask the director of the museum, like people are asking these last weeks, what are you going to do to restitute? He just says, oh, most of our collections are from the 80s and 90s, we bought them in the market, they are legal. I mean, and then people say, yeah, this is a strategy for him not to deal with it. Actually, he has a point. It's actually true, but that doesn't mean that you have all the collections in Portugal. You have them in other institutions. It just means that we never had this kind of museum for other reasons, right? One last connection that I think is very important when we discuss this decolonisation is that the capital that was used to buy these pieces was obtained by the company through forced labor and near, or I would say, genocidal practices, because they were using camps to run down populations that they were distrusting because they didn't let them go near the rivers because they might be smuggling diamonds, they might be causing opposition. And some of these camps, because of yellow fever, has such a high percentage of death that they were near-death camps, and the labor practices were brutal. So this is how the money was obtained to do this museum and to buy these pieces. So you do restitute a Benin and Oba's head to Dundu Museum in Angola, but with money obtained in a very brutal manner. When the director of Diamond died, he had a huge personal fortune. This is the last thing that I find quite interesting. He was also an art collector, and he collected sculpture from Portugal. So while the Portuguese didn't care much as well about Portuguese heritage in the country, so religious statues, archaeological findings, didn't care much, Ernesto Vilhena was collecting them. And when he dies, the state does this deal with the family. They say, we will not tax the money, your personal fortune, so you will inherit everything, but the collection of your father is central to Portuguese culture. It becomes part of the state, and this is the origin of the National Museum of Asian Arts sculpture collection. So I think that this is something that is not discussed enough, is that the money that was raised in this brutal manner through near slavery and genocidal practices was also the money that allowed these men to acquire the statues that now you can go to the National Art Museum and see. And what does this National Ancient Art Museum history tells you? It tells you the story of this European country, right, in which was always settled by white people. You know, it gives you this image. So the way that the Portuguese constructed their own history, self-image, was also on the back of these people. So all of these things are somehow connected. And the Portuguese can tell you, we don't have this universal museum, we didn't use these brutal tactics. Well, they helped stop the museums in Germany. Baumann collection here, the Humboldt Forum, he was getting it while working Diamond. So Diamond was the platform to distribute all of these collections, and at the same time, they did help the Portuguese new state regime, a dictatorial regime, somehow fill this blank by financing these national collections. And I think that it's very difficult to debate this now in Portugal because by looking at what's happening in Europe, there you go, the idea of what's happening in France, what's happening in Belgium, what's happening in Germany or in England, and thinking that our history will be the same, you don't really look at the specificities, right? And I think that this is where most of the details are missed.
Can you give us just a for clarification for also our audience, when did Angola gain independence?
So the regime fell on 74, and the independence treaties were signed in 75, but it is now finally recognized, widely recognized, that the independence struggle was essential for the revolution in Portugal. So that different independent movements in the former colonies or colonized countries, and the 10 or more years of colonial war were what really brought the regime to a kneel. And when you have the Carnation Revolution in 74, it is as a result of that. So now we recognize that the Portuguese Democratic Revolution started in Africa. For a long time, it was not recognized. Meaning, yeah, it was the opposite. We say, oh, we had a revolution, and the Portuguese gave independence. But now, finally.
Yeah, so 75, I really like to remind this to audiences, right? Because it's not even 100 years ago. I mean, it's really a recent history. And if we talk about Namibia gaining independence in the 90s from South Africa, I mean, it's just the day before yesterday, right? So, and now you make this movement really interesting, which I don't see happening in Germany in the near future, that you say that African history, in the case of Angola, has been accepted as a part of a national history in Portugal, in a sense.
I would say more through figures like Emil Cabral, who is more consensual for a number of reasons, because of his legacy after independence. I would say that Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde are seen now. Angola and Mozambique, of course, people recognize that it started there as well, but it's less consensual whose figure you're going to pick, because the independence leaders are not as consensual figures. But nowadays, Amilcar Cabral is widely celebrated as somebody who you should be recognizing as one of the fathers of Portuguese democracy. Wow.
Okay,
That is a huge step.
much more than Germany has done, I would say. Perhaps we can ask Laura how present is Congolese history for Belgium.
Yeah, it has been way more present in recent years. I think we can all agree that the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 has really forced a lot of countries to face their own history, and has given an opportunity for movements who had already started, who had been present and vocal for decades but not listened to really bring those questions more under the spotlight. But I don't think we are anywhere close to celebrating Patrice Lumumba as a father of democracy in Belgium. Talking about Patrice Lumumba, I think we are still discussing to this day the return of his body to Congo. It was only done last June, part of his body, and the whole process around recognizing that his death was caused by the Belgian state is still very much a debate to this day. It is still something that is being brought up by the Congolese community, but also by the Congolese state in their current exchanges with the Belgian state. So it is a very much a burning question for Belgium, and I like that you remind us that this colonial history is recent history. This is modern history. I am from Rwanda myself. My parents came to Belgium following the genocide. For me, this is very much a history of my family and of my living parents and grandparents, this colonial history. So it still has an impact And something that I fear is that we can see a form of capture of this debate around decolonization to focus more and more on questions of identity politics, as we would call them, regarding discrimination, regarding more diversity and inclusion initiatives, and I will say, yeah, more neoliberal friendly visions of decolonization, and forgetting that at the core, when you localize and contextualize where decolonization came from, it came from movement of international solidarity as well. Portugal is a beautiful example of a movement of solidarity between the workers' class in Portugal and the movement of liberation in Guinea-Bissau, in Angola, and Mozambique, who brought up this revolution. And I am very afraid when I see that decolonization in Belgium means more and more will we have police officers of color? I feel like we've missed the mark somewhere there when this is the core of the discussion. Or will this colonial museum be led by a person of color? Of course, we need more diversity and more inclusion in Belgian society. I really hope that, especially in the current movement around Congo and the war in the eastern part of Congo that's happening now, that we remind ourselves as well that this discussion of colonization has to include the people in Congo and Rwanda and Burundi, for which this history is very much a current history. It is not a past history. This is what they are still living through the consequences now. So yeah, the debate around colonization, it is alive in Belgium, but I do fear that we are reducing it more and more to the question of decolonizing the public space, which is vital, to the question of diversity and inclusion, which are also vital, forgetting that decolonization at the core means the liberation of people in the global south, but by way of also liberating us here in the global north of those colonial structure and colonial structure of our societies. So yeah, I am hoping for more from those movements.
Yes. Thank you, Mark, for the
Yeah, a bit.
a bit.
Because the case of Portugal is really interesting, and I would say a very single one, because I would not say that Germany is celebrating Umniube, for instance, those who have fought for the Cameroonian independence. Far away from that, the German museums have always said that we have nothing from the colonies. Even 5 years ago, and even before we published our book, it was not known that Germany has fought as object from a single colony. And there are ongoing projects about Namibia, about Tanzania, about Togo. And it is a lot discussed about this restitution. Almost every day now in Germany, you get an article in newspaper published about the topic, but what is done practically? Nothing. And that's why it's sometimes a very political debate, because it changes always. You have the greener, the position is different from the CSU, CDU, and it's so attached to the political positions of the parties that you can't really say what will be happening in 2, 3, 5 years. And that's the problem in that debate. But in the case of Cameroon, the government is still struggling, because we are also pushing pressure. Germany must not decide alone. The objects belong to other people. That's why you can't ignore the pressure of all those countries in that debate. It is true that Germany has its own position and its own policy, but the time when Germany was the single voice is over. And today we have to consider the pressure from Africa, from Cameroon, from Tanzania, from Namibia. And even it's the same thing in other European countries, because David Wilson, who was the director of the British Museum, was from 1977 to 1902, always said everything we have, the export them legally. So the position of Great Britain was that we have nothing to give back because it was normal for us to take those objects away from our colonies. And the director of the ethnographic museum in Berlin always said this called, because he made an interview with the Spiegel in 1979 that was very famous, and he said if we give those objects back, it is a kind of, it is irresponsible and unfair to give in to the developing countries. So his position was always that those are nationalistic movements. We cannot deal with the question of restitution. All this time is over, but we are still struggling. That's something I would like to add. And yeah, we have now, since the 15th of January, the Cameroon-German dialogue. And we hope that at the end of this dialogue, something will be happening, because now Cameroon has never had a single object from those 40,000 back. So it's a long journey.
We do have to change the language into action as well, right? That's the problem also what Laura said regarding this nice concepts of intersectionality and diversity and inclusion, but what happens when things and the rules stay as they are until now, and only this kind of dialogue settings are being put into place. But at the same time, Michael, you mentioned that not only Germany is changing demographically and also other countries around Europe, but also that the former colonies are also not being silenced anymore, right? And there's a legitimate interest to be a part of the debate. I would like to ask you on another subject which is really delicate, and I'm not sure if you want to comment on it. Feel free to jump in. In your research, have you dealt with also human remains? All three of you, I suppose. And have you get some answers of why there was this necrophilia of taking also human remains to Europe?
You understand?
Well, I don't know. I can only say that is a very long practice. This is really what strikes me as odd, because I began my academic career as an anthropologist, and only then a PhD in history. And I always thought that it was the practice of collecting these human remains, cults, was something situated, that it came from physical anthropology, so 19th century visual science. And then when I enter the archives and I find that Jesuit priests were doing it in the 15th century here at home, or in the Kingdom of Congo, in the Kingdom of Ndongo, it's just like, it blew my mind. But yes, they were doing these wars, and they were collecting ears or noses or other parts as a way of, as tokens, and bringing boxes to offer the king. And I was like, I have no theory. I just know that then in the 16th and 17th century, there's a lot of folk theories going around in Angola of why the whites do that. And there's a lot of poetry, and there's a lot of myth that connects technology to this, but that's, as you call it, this necromancy or necrophilia, is something that it comes from this very long history of objectifying, or taking parts for the whole, or trying to master a human being by reducing it, and reducing it to this part. And it's very dark, and I don't know, but to my surprise, I mean, to me, it was a shock entering this older archive and discovering that has 5 centuries of history to it, while I thought it was a modern scientific thing. Yeah, my masters.
Yeah, maybe just before Laura jumps in, alongside my research on artifacts, I've been dealing with the human remains from Cameroon in the German collection since more than 2 years already. And I work in a project called Sensitive Provenances at the University of Göttingen, where there is more than 1,200 human remains from Africa and Oceania. And in the anthropological collection of the university, there are 10 skulls from Cameroon acquired during the colonial time. And you have people like Konetsko selling both human remains and cultural artifacts. People like Umlauf and then Blumenbach who collected all those skulls. And even the Humboldt Forum that is in Berlin, the museum is called after Humboldt, and his history is not not known, but when Humboldt wanted the skulls for his racial theories, he went in the colonies and collected skulls. And when he went somewhere, he didn't find the skull he wanted, and he ordered people to be buried alive because he wanted absolutely to have those skulls. And sometimes after they were dug out, and Humboldt had his skull. So it was a very, very violent history. And now at the center of Berlin, you have a museum, an exhibition space called after this man. So that is something that is, when you work with archives and all those things, it is something that you discover that is not known to the public. So in the case of Cameroon, there are those 10 skulls at the University of Göttingen, and I've tried to establish a kind of a map or atlas of all those human remains also in Germany. But there is an ongoing thesis at the Heinrich Heine University, a colleague of mine who is trying to establish a list of all those Cameroonian human remains in Germany. But one thing I could say is that they have been taken alongside the objects, and the way they took them was also very violent, because in some cases they have dug out even the remains of people who were already buried. So that is something that is very brutal. And I have worked on a special case, the skull of an 8-year-old child that have been brought from Batimo to Hamburg. And then at some point in the 50s, Hamburg said, we want to get rid of that collection of human remains, and they wanted to destruct the whole collection. But a professor at the University of Göttingen said, instead of destroying those human remains, please send them to us. And then they transferred the collection from Hamburg to Göttingen, I think in 2 times, but the transfer was not done truly. So even today you have some cases where part of the same skull is divided into 2 collections. One part is in Hamburg and the other part is in Göttingen. So that's something, the violence is still going on when you consider how those human remains are kept in those German collections and lying even in boxes, because when you see them, you enter the collection, you enter the archive, you walk on those collections, they are just kept in boxes. And in some cases, you have 2 skulls in a single box. So I have been discussing also that issue for a long time with Leontina, the director of the Ethnographic Museum in Leipzig. Germany is more sensitive to that topic and want to give the human remains back. The Republic of Palau was engaging on the 25th of March to take back the ancestor from Palau. Prior to that, Hawaii was there, represented also through the General Council of the United States, because Hawaii is now part of the United States. And prior to that was also New Zealand there to take part to repatriate the ancestor of New Zealand people. So there is something going on in that domain, but it's still a bit difficult because it is a sensitive issue. There is a press release that the University of Göttingen has set out and saying that the university is, in any case, ready to give back the collection to the different countries. But still, it is not just a matter of giving back, we have to know the history behind those collections, behind those scholars. I think the restitution applies also to restitution of knowledge. It is not something that we have to move the objects or the environments from Cameroon from Germany to Cameroon, but we have to narrate how they came to be in German collections. And if that history is not known, it's maybe a kind of restitution, but if it is just reduced to a physical movement, it's not so that interesting.
Would you like to comment, Laura? Or would you like to keep the question?
No. I was just thinking when you were talking about the question of restituting also knowledge. I think one initiative that I've been really appreciating from the African Museum is that they've been working with universities in Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi to have researchers coming and work on the archives of the museum itself to, in one way, help with this preparation to restitutions, to know where the artifacts are coming from and what context they were taken, but also to come back to this idea, this argument of, oh yeah, we cannot give them back because they don't have the expertise there to care for it. And I feel like this is something very practical, that is an initiative from the museum, from the workers of the museum, who are also trying to launch their own revolution from the inside. And I do think this is something that is easy enough to implement that I'm surprised not more museums are embracing. But yeah, I do think that this question of the knowledge around the artifacts is central in the restitution debate.
Yes. Thank you very much. So that they do not get decontextualized again.
Let's jump in really quick because there's a case in Portugal that I think connects both with this question of decontextualization and also to another aspect of human remains, which is this. In some places, they're still exhibited. That this is something that now assumes a different relevance. The University of Coimbra, so the oldest Portuguese university, is a science museum, and recently, 3 years ago, they decided to open a new exhibition, supposedly showing the audience how our Wunder cabinet would look like. But there are two problems with this: is that you never had those in Portugal, and not a Portuguese tradition, for a number of reasons. You don't have them. So they just went to the literature, and they're trying to give you an idea of how a German Wunder cabinet would look like. So they created with bits and pieces from different periods. And I had a debate with the director. I found it an aberration because they are showing objects from Diamond, for instance, from the 20th century, objects from Amazonia from the 18th century, objects from older collections to illustrate the cabinet from the 16th, 15th century, as if there is no historicity in this part. And they opened this new attraction with human remains. So you're showing human remains as well. And this just becomes macabre because then you add a small plaque saying this practice was terrible, but it was done, and it becomes this kind of dark tourism. The thing was not there. This is not a question of decolonizing or this. They created from scratch a pure Disneyland fantasy because Portugal never had the cabinet. And they point to the problem while showing you authentic human remains. And this is still on. It's having a huge turnout. I mean, yeah, people are visiting it. Tourists are visiting. You can buy a ticket for the whole university that includes this museum. I think it's, if you're talking about one of the dangers of this, is this kind of dark
not only one of the oldest universities in Portugal, but also in whole Europe. Yeah. Okay, yeah. We have talked about a little bit about museums, the difficulty of these places, but also museum as a public space, which is contested the whole time. Now it's up to you to make another dimensions or to ask if you want to go into deepness in one subject or the other. Please feel free to join our discussion and conversation.
I would have a first question to my brother. I'm interested to know if the dialogue is also ongoing in the African context, either the countries of origin of those artifacts. Because of late in Nigeria, one of the museum director was a point about that. Some of the artists were like those artifacts, they've never seen them before, but they heard about them and they would like to have them back to get what do you call it? To help them reproduce the same artifacts. So another dialogue was people making a point that they don't need, they are not used to those or they don't know what to do with them. So how is the current state as far as the academia is concerned? How is the discourse? Is it any serious discourse going on as to the countries, let's say Africa, our country themselves, how involved are they in the academia?
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, I would like to stress that we researchers, we do not decide on the behalf of the communities. We are doing the research and we share the knowledge with the communities, but they are the one initiating all those demands for restitution. So, if one community says we want our objects to remain in Germany, that is their position. And since 5 years already, or at least since Benin has taken back the 26 objects from France, in different African countries, each government has set up a national commission to deal with the issue. Because before that movement, there were the different communities and the civil societies where people have tried to put pressure, and then civil organizations, non-profit organizations have also participated in that debate to try to bring the question forward. But academia is just doing its job as research. And I will say that I am a bit disappointed about what is happening now in all those African countries, because Cameroon, for instance, has its own national commission dealing with the topic of repatriation, and Nigeria does the same. And we had long discussions with Yusuf Tuga, who was the Nigerian ambassador in Berlin and now the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Nigeria. He was really aware of all those questions. But at the end, those countries are doing or are dealing with the question as if our boundaries before colonizations were the boundaries of today. When we talk about Cameroon, it's a Cameroon that has maybe 3, 5, 6 different forms, because the boundaries kept moving following colonial interest. I would like to consider an example of a village called Tikwa that is today in the northern part of Nigeria. Between 1884 to 1912, it was a Cameroonian village. But then it kept moving between Nigeria, Cameroon. Once the UK signed a contract with Germany, they give back this part of Cameroon. And once the term of the contract changed, the village goes back to Nigeria. So, and today in the databases of the museums, we have so many objects from that village, and they are referred to as Cameroonian. That is correct. They are also referred to as Nigerian. That is correct. But today, the village is in Nigeria. So, when Cameroonian decides just to deal with Germany without involving Nigeria, is a problem. Because in this case, precisely, which country is able to send a demand for restitution to Germany? And also the German part is playing with such kind of cases to say it's not normal that the object leaves our museum because you are not the right owner. And they are right. So that's why my personal position is that we must try to collaborate more as countries and not ignore that our boundaries have been moving since the European came to us. Today, these dimensions fails, and the Nigerian Commission comes to, they were there to take back the Benin bronzes. But the problem is that Nigeria has also boundaries with Ghana, with other countries, and everywhere, the same problem is there. We Cameroonian have, I think, 6 or 5 neighbor countries. And it's the same problem with Gabon, Congo, Nigeria, Chad, Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea. But the government just decided to ignore all these dimensions. And I've discussed the issue with colleagues at the African Union in Addis Ababa. It is something that is, I think the government have to do it themselves, because in Addis Ababa the complaint is that people working there are sent by the countries. The African Union has not the right to say, you countries, you have to collaborate. It doesn't work like that. Even in Brussels, Germany sent its own people, France sent its own people. It's the same thing everywhere, and those diplomats are there to defend other interests. It's not always the restitution that they are more interested in. And in the case of those African countries, it's more interesting because the foundation called, there is a foundation founded by George Soros. They have I just forget the name, they have Open Society. They have an office in Addis Ababa trying to convince the African countries to put more collaboration. But the colleague working there is just tired of people who are, the diplomat just talk every day, they keep talking, and that is what we are experiencing in Berlin. Go to that embassy, you talk, and afterwards, because when you discuss with them, they have also other things in their minds going on. And I think that, and I went even to meet my prime minister in Cameroon, they keep talking. Everything you say, they are all right with that, but at the end of the day, there is no collaboration between Nigeria and Cameroon. And that is something that we have to solve, because it is a real problem. Boundaries of Nigeria means nothing if you do not integrate the dimension that they have been moving. And in our case, it is in 2008 that we have drawn the last line with Nigeria as to say, here is Nigeria, here is Cameroon. We went even to the International Court of Justice. It is less than 20 years that we have now fixed territories of Cameroon. So it means a lot, and you can't ignore that part in that debate of restitution. The Europeans are aware of that, and they are playing also to get more than.
Perhaps Laura wants to comment a little bit?
I didn't hear the question, I just heard the answer.
Yeah, but related to the answer, I assume you just heard the answer. Perhaps, so how,
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that you remind us those borders have moved, but also that there are geopolitical questions in between those countries. In the case of Belgian own colonial history, it's now dealing with three countries that don't get along, that will not be sitting around the table and discuss a common cause regarding these restitutions. And yeah, the rule of divide and rule still continues, and it's still very easy to quickly say, well, then there is no solution because those countries won't agree, and we don't exactly know. This is more between Burundi and Rwanda, where we know that the cultural history is very close, and that there are more questions around the borders. It's very hard to also lead those debates further if we cannot have a common discussion about it. So when the parliament was tasked to look into these questions, and that they went to Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo to meet with their like the officials as well to discuss it, I did find it so sad that we were not able to get this discussion in groups, and that it was done country to country when we know that it is a common history that those three countries have with Belgium, and that they would be stronger in their arguments if they were able to come together on those questions. But indeed, restitution is not always their main question or goal or debate that they have on their own local level. So they had different demands, and Rwanda was very quickly satisfied with just scanning some archive documents and we'll see for the rest. While Congo has a more active civil society around those questions as well, and who's been way louder on the question of restitutions of artifacts to the national museums in Congo. And I am sad that we are not able to get those countries to agree that they have here a common interest in fighting together for those restitutions.
We could also analyze this a little bit as a legacy of Europe, I would say, because they decided not only about the borders, but also the idea of the nation state, and one country not getting along with the other. We know that history a lot from this continent or part continent, and they invented Europe, the European Union, to get along a little bit better. We will see what happens next week.
Yeah.
Are there any questions?
Just to piggyback on what just to piggyback on what he asked, what could actually be done to decolonize the African people, or the history that African people actually know? Because I feel like when we just talk about restitution amongst researchers, and people in Africa don't even know that they have stolen artifacts in Europe. Where does this all lead to? And so can you maybe mention on that?
It will come back down.
Yeah, thank you. The projects we mentioned at the beginning is still going on, and in the second phase, we will not carry out any research anymore, but we will just share the results of the first phase with different communities in Cameroon, because this point is very important. But also we discover that not all communities are not aware of what they lost. There are communities who are very aware of what they lost and precisely under which conditions. That's why the first demand for restitution for Africa came in 1961, just 1 year after the independence of 70s former colonies across the continent. And those people kept moving until 1978, until 1982, and then the debate was a kind of pushback. But in Cameroon, for instance, there is a region called grassland. Those people know exactly what they have lost. They know this town is in Munich, this town is in Hamburg, this town is in Berlin, and they have sent requests for restitution even before the government set up this national commission. So they have a kind of advance in this question. And today there are some people who are even angry, trying to say that the government is moving us from what we have been doing since decades already. But in some cases also there are communities where their remembrance culture, as it is called, this remembrance culture is totally absent. People do not know even that they are being attacked. There was forced labor, and in our school system it was presented as positive aspects of colonization. And when you ask the teacher what is about this positive aspect, they told you colonists have constructed bridges, schools, and no one tells us that it was forced labor of the colonized themselves. Not a single German has ever taken a piece of wood from A to B. No, they were just there to tell to the people that you have to construct those roads, you have to control those bridges, and people died. Until today, we do not know exactly how many parents we have lost in those forced labor, and that's the problem. Colonization has ever had positive aspects. No, it doesn't exist. And that's also how the colonial history has been teaching in African countries for decades. And even today, I remember the president of the Senate in Congo when a scientific commission in Congo released a report on Belgian cases, and the president of the Senate said this report is too hard. It has to be come down, because but those are historic facts. We are not inventing anything. And lecturers at universities, I have colleagues who told that to their students that colonization had positive aspects. It's just a pity. So the problem is that discussing it in academia doesn't mean that everyone is trying to decolonize his minds. We are still struggling with colleagues that teach their university students doing PhDs in some cases that colonization was a good thing. And I can even quote some sayings that I've lived in South Africa with a professor coming with his PhD student at a conference at the University of Western Cape and arguing that Namibia is so developed because it was a South African colony, and that South Africa is so developed because of the apartheid. And we were nearly to fight, really, because that is something that was not expected in such a kind of international conference where the attendees came from more than 10 countries. And in a big country like South Africa, they give you the floor in front of an audience that speak about a sensitive topic, and you say that South Africa is developed because apartheid was there. People left the hall, and it was a moment of the discussion was, I don't know if we really finished that session, but it was a kind of keep talking, I'm not with you. But we will try to also work with organizations outside of the university as to share that knowledge, because you are right, it must not stay just at the universities.
Would you like to comment? Have you had this opportunity to work with communities in Angola, or?
Yeah, not on topics of restitution, but also a topic that you hear things that you think you will never hear. And I'm talking about the basically the transatlantic trade of enslaved persons that you will never think that nowadays you will hear somebody enslaved. And of course the...
Recently in the United States, you mean?
Sorry?
Recently in the United States?
No,
Or
no,
do you mean
in Portugal,
as well? Okay.
Yes, referring to Portugal. So this is, you asked if I work with communities regarding restitution of not just museums. I haven't, but we work with communities regarding the memorial of the enslaved and visible. And following this debate, this public debate, and this is something that comes across regularly. Yeah, those people are better off in Brazil or New York, so that is this parallel. I think that all the practices that you use to somehow not address the topic, from discussing who were the owners of the ships, if Portugal, all these kind of ways of shifting around or discussing, but there was also a slave trade in Muslim countries, all these things that you see happen the same, and you kind of face the same problem when you want to address the legacies of this, when you want to address systemic racism, what happened during abolition, that you kind of shift towards a regime based on systemic racism, racist institutions, and you still face this basic argument of professors saying, yeah.
Laura, we still have 2 more minutes, perhaps?
Yeah, I think I heard the question well. It was around how do we decolonize the minds of African people. Was that the initial question? Because I wasn't sure. I heard, and I think the phrasing is quite important. And I want to get back to what Miguel speaking was saying at the beginning, that Africa is not a monolith. It is not a country. So I will have a hard time answering that question. How do we it's as hard as a question as how do we decolonize Europe. But I do want to remind people that those movements of decolonization, they did not start here. They started by the people who were concerned by those questions, and we are just catching up. We are catching up on their knowledge around this, and we're trying to retrieve after this epistemicide that was done through colonialism, that does not allow us to access all the knowledge that has existed in the past in previously colonized country. And I don't think that the question is so much how do we decolonize Africans, but much more what can we do from where we are now to create a space where those Africans can advocate for themselves as well. I think in Belgium, I think it was 5 years ago, that a museum, the biggest museum in Antwerp, did an exhibition called 100 Times Congo, where they had 100 pieces of their archives retracing the history between Antwerp, so coastal city in Belgium, and Congo. And at the end of this exhibition, they had a short movie where they were interviewing people in Belgium and in Congo on what should we do with those artifacts. As well, professors, as people working in bars, as people working in museums, as artists as well, and people coming from those places where the artifacts was taken. And I think we do have this idea that it is a debate that only exists in the North, the question of restitution, but it very much exists in the global South as well. There are communities for which those artifacts are not just pieces in a museum, but living part of their spirituality, of their practices, of their history as well, and who do claim a need to bring them back, and who've been fighting for it for a very long time. And I think showing those images, because of course some people just don't know, are in the same place as a lot of people here in Europe, where they only have access to the history that were taught in schools, and those schools were still constructed on a colonial structure, and they don't have access to that knowledge, and they will maybe not have an interest in these institutions. But there are vibrant communities who do have an interest in them. And I do think that what we can do to decolonize Africa is create from our places of privilege in the global North a space around the table for those people to advocate for themselves, and to tell us also on which schedule to set the agenda of how this restitution can happen. It is not something that we should just discuss elites from elites, leaders of countries to leaders of countries, but also with the people who've been advocating and working around the retrieval of those artifacts for a long time. I hope I didn't go beyond my 2 minutes.
No, we still have some 7 minutes left, so thank you. Okay, any other question perhaps? This is the first and last time you have the opportunity to talk to 3 experts at the time in such a nice setting, so perhaps you want to know a little bit more of each research.
If not, I would like to come back to the question about the human remains, because there is in Germany, in Belgium, in France, in other European countries, you can go online, search for human skull. That is to be solved. You can get it. That is what is happening now. You have the price, you have the image online, everything. And in Belgium, there are even auction houses selling them in a hole like this. And it's not forbidden. So there is no way to tell those auction houses do not sell human body. There is a project of law going on in Brussels now, so that the European Union can try to limit this auction with human bodies in the whole of Europe, because if we see each country's wants a law, it will take a lot of time. And I do hope that with the election that we have in 1 week, we get maybe an interesting combination of things that will bring that law forward, and then we have it voted. If not, till there it is something that is considered normal.
Yeah, the dismembering. Your colleague works on a project called like this, remembering the
Remembering the dates. Disremembering the dates.
Yeah. So it's a past which is hunting, and what I have learned from this amazing panel is that we still have to reclaim memory back as a terrain which may also put together African countries and European countries in another situation, not that hierarchical anymore, but memory, and which is being fought for in many communities, beyond schools, beyond universities, and make these memories visible instead of extracting them as diamonds, for example, right? So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to talk to you. I hope we keep the conversation going, and thank you for visiting us.